A homeless man ordered the cheapest boxed meal, but when it came time to pay, he found he was 1 dime short. He pleaded with the owner to give him a break, but the owner threw the meal into the sink, preferring to waste it rather than give it to him. With no other choice, he had to rummage through the trash to fill his stomach. As it was late and the cold wind was biting, after barely filling up, he prepared to find a corner to spend the night. Just then, a friend he hadn't contacted in a long time invited him to rest in his car. Although he didn't want to get involved with him, James, who had been searching for a place to stay for a long time, reluctantly got into the car. It turns out they were both once gentlemen. But James is currently trying to quit drugs and return to a normal life, while his friend is still living a life of debauchery. Even the car they were in had its lock picked by his friend. Perhaps eager to share, his friend immediately took out some contraband as soon as James got in the car. James was expected to resist the temptation, but surprisingly, he chose to indulge, and the next day, when the car owner found him, he was unconscious from an overdose. His friend, seeing this, was so scared that he ran away. Fortunately, the car owner was kind-hearted and took him to the hospital in time. Otherwise the consequences would have been unimaginable. Since his parents had long stopped caring for him, the only person who came to visit him was Dr. Val, who was responsible for helping him quit drugs. Despite James tearfully apologizing and vowing never to relapse, Val didn't want to hear his excuses, as this was already his second time making such promises. However, Val didn't plan to give up on him and even set up a new detox plan for him as soon as he recovered, providing free methadone daily and requiring a report every 2 weeks. At the same time, Val sternly warned him that if he stopped taking methadone and relapsed, the consequences could be fatal. Despite not saying it out loud, James was deeply grateful for Val's unwavering support and heartfelt advice. So, before leaving, he expressed his gratitude with his most sincere singing. Val chose to continue helping him because he felt the purity of his soul through his singing. In the days that followed, James took his medication while singing on the streets to make a living. Not wanting to see him homeless, Val used his connections to secure a welfare apartment for him. Although the apartment was in a chaotic environment, the inside of the apartment was quite shabby, but for James, it was heaven on earth with a sofa, a soft bed, and hot water for a bath. After an emotional farewell to Val, James sat silently on the sofa for a long time, just to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Then, he got into the bathtub and enjoyed a long-awaited hot bath. But just then, he heard a noise from the living room. Thinking it was a thief, James immediately grabbed a shoe for defense and followed the sound to the kitchen, only to find an orange cat stealing cereal. Perhaps driven by the kindness in his heart, or maybe because he had experienced hunger himself, James didn't chase away the cat that had intruded into his home. Instead, he took out the last bit of milk from the fridge and let the orange cat enjoy a hearty meal with the cereal. Although he saw himself as worthless, he hoped to nurture something beautiful like a flower. But after doing all this, he felt sad again, thinking that this cat wasn't abandoned like him but had just wandered off by accident. So, after the cat had eaten its fill, he opened the window, ready to let it go free. Unexpectedly, the cat not only refused to leave but also easily snuggled into his arms. In that moment, James was touched and decided to keep the cat for the night, planning to find its owner the next morning. For the first time, the lonely James had warm companionship. The cat seemed to understand human nature, quietly listening to his singing and, after he fell asleep, jumped onto the bed to snuggle beside him. The next morning, James took the cat and started knocking on doors, asking around. But apart from being turned away and hearing various dismissive remarks, he found nothing. By then, James had realized that the cat might be a stray and felt a pang of sympathy. However, the harsh reality forced him to face the fact that he could barely support himself, let alone adopt a cat. So, in the end, he released the cat into the wild. Then, as usual, he went to the hospital to get his methadone. Afterward, he went to a market near the subway. Unexpectedly, because he was affecting the business of a store behind him, he was ruthlessly chased away by the staff. At that moment, he saw the figure of his father. Excitedly, he chased after him, but his father, who also saw him, avoided him like the plague, not only refusing to stop but even quickening his pace. However, in the end, he still couldn't escape. The father and son, who hadn't seen each other for days, chatted like strangers, talking about their recent situations. Suddenly, the father's idle wife also came over. Seeing this, James immediately asked with a pleading tone, "Christmas is coming soon, can I spend it with you?" However, before the father could speak, the stepmother immediately refused. She disliked James for being an addict and was afraid he would be a bad influence on her 2 young daughters. It's often said that with a stepmother comes a stepfather, and sure enough, the father also expressed his opposition. But out of guilt, as he was leaving, the father symbolically gave James $100. Feeling defeated, James returned home in disappointment, only to find Biggie crouching at the door, covered in blood. Apparently, he had been attacked, but he didn't know how to handle it, so he could only hold the cat and seek help from others. Just then, the girl next door returned. She happened to volunteer at a veterinary clinic, so she knew a bit about nursing. However, after checking, she found that Biggie's injuries were quite serious and needed hospital treatment. Otherwise, the wounds might fester. Upon hearing this, James panicked because he had no money to treat Biggie, and besides, he wasn't the cat's owner. But the girl said that love cannot be measured by money, and since the cat came to you, it must be a sign. Don't push it away easily. After saying this, she gave James the address of a pet hospital that offers free treatment for stray animals. After explaining everything, Betty then asked them to leave. Because she was severely allergic to fur. After expressing his gratitude, James took Biggie to the hospital. However, due to the hospital being short-staffed and having many patients, James had to wait a long time for his turn. Helplessly, he could only sit quietly with Biggie in the waiting area. However, all the surrounding animals were restless due to pain or the unfamiliar environment, making the already neurotic James even more irritable. Only Biggie remained calm and composed, serene despite being in a bustling place. Unknowingly, 2 hours passed, and Biggie finally got to see the doctor. Fortunately, his wounds hadn't festered. Unfortunately, the medication cost a full $20. With little money, James asked the nurse for a discount, but she refused. With no other choice, James had to use the $100 his father gave him. Originally, this was exactly his weekly food budget. Now, with $20 deducted in advance, he'll have to skip several meals. Worse yet, the medicine he bought with his meal money, Bob just wouldn't take. Because of this, a battle of wits ensued between the man and the cat. In the end, James was completely defeated. Fortunately, the neighbor girl Betty stepped in to help again, and the two became even more familiar with each other. Since James was more like Bob, Betty naturally gave him this name. At the same time, she reminded James that Bob not only needed protein supplements but also needed to be neutered as soon as possible to prevent his aggressive genes from getting him killed outdoors. After saying this, she asked about James's personal situation. Afraid to reveal that he was an addict, James only shared part of the truth. When I was very young, my mother took me to Australia, and I only recently returned to London alone. I originally planned to live with my father, but he has now started a new family and has new children. So, to avoid being a nuisance, I chose to live alone. Currently, I make a living by busking on the streets. After hearing this, Betty just sighed and said, "You must really miss your father." But James didn't respond directly. After parting with Betty, James quickly found Dr. Val. He was supposed to report his progress yesterday, but he was delayed by taking Bob to the vet. Feeling guilty, James explained and recounted everything that had happened recently, including meeting his father, saving Bob, and developing feelings for Betty. After hearing this, Val couldn't help but feel a strong sense of worry. Because during drug withdrawal, the most taboo thing is emotional fluctuations, especially getting involved in relationships, as it can severely affect one's mental state. After all, even rational people can become hopelessly crazy when they fall in love, let alone someone already emotionally unstable like an addict. Although these words sounded harsh, James understood that what he needed to do now was not to fall in love, but to learn how to manage his emotions. Because only when he becomes unbreakable and not controlled by external factors will he be qualified to be someone who can accept love. For the next period of time, James spent his days with Bob and even took him to get neutered. The man and the cat comforted and healed each other in this way. Soon, Bob fully recovered his health. James also resumed his street performances. But on this day, for some reason, Bob kept quietly following James, even when James, ignoring the looks from others, tried to talk him into going back. Bob just playfully gestured, trying to get away with it. Helpless, James thought everything would be fine once he got on the bus, but to his surprise, Bob followed him on. Seeing such an adorable cat, all the passengers smiled indulgently. But when Bob couldn't find James, he climbed up to the second level without hesitation and jumped onto James. Although it was unbelievable, after getting the conductor's approval, James let Bob stay by his side. And Bob, as always, was well behaved and obedient. At the front of the bus, he looked like a lion statue by the roadside, curiously stretching his neck to look around, as if announcing his arrival to the world. Soon, the bus reached the stop, and the conductor handed James a leash to prevent the cat from running off and getting into danger. After getting off, with the crowd bustling around, Bob looked around alertly, exploring this new world with curious eyes. Perhaps afraid he might get scared, James crouched down to let him jump onto his shoulder. Thus, a unique and magical one-man, one-cat duo was born. In the past, passers-by would hardly notice this shabby young man on the street. But now, everyone's attention was focused on this special pair. Some chose to take photos with them, while others generously offered support and encouragement. James sang more confidently and robustly, while Bob, like an unflappable superstar, looked down on everything happening. After the performance, James found that today's earnings were several times more than the past week. And he knew it was all thanks to Bob. So, he immediately went to the supermarket and bought lots of canned food for Bob. It wasn't until the neon lights replaced the sun in lighting up the city that they took the bus home together. From then on, every day on the streets of London, passers-by would witness this scene, a man with a ginger cat performing their unique musical story at the street market. Sometimes, the ginger cat would sit obediently on the guitar, as if adding to the music. Other times, it would sit quietly beside its owner, sharing that peaceful moment. Gradually, their performances attracted more and more attention and affection. James's life gradually got back on track, but life is always full of absurdities. When a person reforms and starts to walk the right path, those who once fell with him become envious. This is human nature. Initially, when his friend, a drug addict, came to him, James didn't want to pay attention. But seeing his friend looking so emaciated, he softened and gave him money. He just hoped his friend could have a good meal. However, that night, he saw his friend lying motionless on the ground near his home, with a used syringe scattered beside him. Realizing something was wrong, James immediately went to check the situation and then loudly called for help. Hearing the call, Betty rushed over to perform resuscitation. But when the ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, his friend had already stopped breathing and his heart had stopped. Watching his friend die, James could only curl up helplessly in the corner, woodenly blaming himself. Because it was the money he gave that cost his friend his life. And at that moment, not knowing how to comfort him, Betty revealed her own secret. It turned out she deeply hated drug addicts, and this hatred stemmed from her own brother. Her brother was a talented artist, but after getting into bad habits, he turned into a monster, only knowing how to deceive his family and harm himself. Even when he died, he still had a syringe in his body. Since then, Betty moved to this shelter full of drug addicts, which was also where her brother lived before he died, hoping to save more lives with her small strength to make up for the guilt of not being able to save her brother. But at the same time, she also hated these people because they not only looked down on themselves but also on everyone around them who loved them. The death of his friend, along with Betty's monologue, hit James like a heavy hammer on his heart. He didn't want to end up like his friend or Betty's brother, didn't want to fail to express his love for Betty, and didn't want to lose Bob and everything he had worked so hard to achieve. So, he went to Dr. Val and asked to stop taking the anti-addiction medication immediately. He felt his determination was strong enough to quit his addiction in one go. However, Dr. Val said, "You are indeed doing great now, and I have a lot of confidence in you. But you can't expect to achieve it all at once, or you might go astray. However, according to your request, I will consider revising the plan. Now, just let go of all your mental burdens and get ready to welcome the upcoming Christmas." Although he knew it was a tactical delay, James had no choice but to accept it. Soon, Christmas arrived. James and Betty decorated the cabin together and delivered Christmas gifts. Although Bob also received a card, he remained expressionless. Just like that, the two of them spent a wonderful and peaceful afternoon filled with laughter and soothing songs. The relationship between James and Betty deepened as they held hands tightly. In the evening, a cheerful James took Bob to his father's house, wanting to surprise him. But when his father opened the door, his face was full of shock. However, James didn't mind and stepped right into the house. Unexpectedly, his two half-sisters' first reaction upon seeing him was to blatantly call him a junkie. Perhaps sensing his unease, Bob suddenly became agitated too. He then uncontrollably ran around the living room, not only knocking over a vase on the dining table but also toppling the Christmas tree full of gifts. Fortunately, James quickly caught her, preventing a bigger disaster. But this sudden visit clearly made the relationship between James and his stepmother even more tense than before. Moreover, Christmas seemed like a turning point, after which unfortunate events followed one after another. That day, while James was busking on the street with Bob, he aroused a man's jealousy. So, the man deliberately let his dog pee on James's bag. Disgusted by such despicable behavior, the onlookers stood up for James. To avoid scaring Bob, James tried his best to avoid the conflict. However, the sudden commotion still caught the attention of the police. Subsequently, James and his group were taken to the police station for questioning. It wasn't until the next day that Val received a notification and bailed James out. Although James was the victim, he was frequently penalized. Worse still, due to the arrest, he couldn't take his anti-addiction medication on time, causing his emotions to gradually spiral out of control. When he finally made it to the pharmacy and hurriedly took his life-saving medication, Betty saw him on the spot. Realizing she had been deceived, Betty stormed out of the pharmacy in anger. She didn't want to say another word to this junkie. Even though James desperately tried to explain, she refused to forgive him. Just like that, James's relationship and career both came to a halt. He also fell into an abyss, and if he indulged in his own weakness, he would continue to sink. Especially when he looked out the window and saw the vendors selling competing products, James couldn't help but walk over. But when he thought of Bob still relying on him, he suppressed his impulse and the next day, he pulled himself together and got a job selling newspapers. Unexpectedly, Bob's lucky charm attribute worked again, and James's business was booming. But just as their life was getting back on track, a newly promoted colleague at McDonald's set him up and reported James for a violation. Due to the company's clear policy that he couldn't sell in his own area, even though it wasn't intentional, James was punished and banned from working for a month. Thus, James lost his source of income again. In the days that followed, he could only rely on his meager savings to barely keep Bob and himself from starving. But soon, the savings ran out, and he could only share a can of food with Bob. Later, he had to go to the relief station for food aid and rummage through trash cans again. But this couldn't fill their stomachs, and Bob was howling with hunger. Helpless, James chose to take the risk and continued to take Bob to the street market. Fortunately, during this time, he wasn't caught by the police. Finally, after a month, James got his job selling bags back. He thought life would improve, but that day, a wealthy mother and son took a liking to Bob and wanted to buy him. Even though James clearly stated that Bob was family, not a commodity, they wouldn't give up and even publicly mocked James, saying he couldn't even support himself. So how could he have the right to keep a cat? Unable to bear it, James immediately retorted. But as they argued fiercely, Bob, startled, suddenly jumped off his shoulder and ran towards the busy street. James, being strong, immediately chased after him. But even as night fell over the city, he couldn't find any trace of Bob. Not only that, but for several days afterward, Bob didn't return home. James, filled with guilt, couldn't find peace day or night. It was as if he had lost his soul, staring blankly at Bob's food dish all day. She was really afraid that Bob would never return. Over time, Bob had become her emotional support. If that support was lost, she would collapse entirely, possibly falling back into the abyss. Fortunately, a week later, Bob returned on his own, and the ecstatic James immediately called the police. He was afraid Bob would leave him again. Afterwards, James found Val and said he was ready to completely say goodbye to solitude. But after hearing this, Val was still a bit worried because the process of quitting drugs is extremely painful, and very few people can persist from start to finish, especially since James was alone. However, James said, "I'm not fighting alone, I have Bob with me. Moreover, ever since I had Bob, I felt respected once again. So, even if it's for Bob, I must overcome myself." With that, James got the approval. But before officially starting to quit drugs, he first found Betty, apologized, and shared his plan. Despite still feeling resentment inside, Betty was willing to help during this period to ensure James's success. For example, by delivering meals or supervising nearby. However, James refused because he didn't want the person he liked to see him in such a miserable state. Once everything was ready, James resolutely embarked on this tough battle against himself. At the beginning, she could still distract herself by playing the piano to maintain emotional rationality. But soon, by the third day, she began to change, the rhythm became erratic, and in severe cases, she even experienced hallucinations. Not only that, as time went on, he started to lose his appetite, and even if he ate, he would quickly vomit it out. Meanwhile, his senses were also changing. Sometimes, he felt like there were thousands of ants gnawing at him from inside his body. Sometimes, even when splashed with ice water, he couldn't feel the cold. Fortunately, every time he was on the verge of losing control, Bob would pull him back. Finally, after enduring for a week, James's condition gradually improved. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed to celebrate his successful transformation. When he stepped out of the room again, the world seemed brand new. The completely reborn James first went to the hospital to thank Dr. Val. Because if it weren't for Val, he might have already become a corpse. However, when she returned to her place, she found Betty was moving out. It turned out that during her time with James, Betty also deeply realized that everyone should live for themselves, not be trapped in past sorrows. So, she decided to move away from the place where her brother once lived and pursue her own life. However, before parting, he gave James his new address and contact information, indicating his willingness to keep in touch with James. Although it was hard to say goodbye, James knew there was no reason to hold him back, so they parted ways with regret. Afterward, James took Bob to find his father. Last time, he was a mess due to his guilty conscience, but now he's clean and can confidently communicate with his father. Initially, his father seemed tense, but when he heard James apologize, he suddenly showed shame and bitterness. Then he took out a photo of James as a child from his wallet. It turns out, all these years, he never truly gave up on James. It was just his weakness and selfishness that kept him from facing him. Suddenly, the stepmother's voice called from the room. This time, instead of hiding as usual, he confidently replied, "I'm here, talking with my son and grandson." At that moment, the years of estrangement between father and son were completely resolved. In the days that followed, everything good seemed to gravitate towards James. Even publishers came to him by reputation. It turns out that when James and Bob were performing on the streets, many people uploaded their videos online. The combination of a man and a cat healed many so-called masked but lonely and fragile souls, so their story quickly went viral on the internet. The publishers wanted to share this inspiring and warm story with more people in darkness, to encourage them to overcome difficulties and regain their lives. Soon after, the book, A Street Cat Named Bob, was officially published, and it caused a sensation upon release. James and Bob became household names overnight. At the book signing, James told all the friends, family, and readers present that everyone has a chance to start over, but not everyone can seize it. So, whether or not you want to make a change, the decision is always yours. The Stray Cat Bob was featured in the biographical film directed by Roger Spottiswoode, starring Luke Treadaway and Bob the Cat himself, released in 2016. Unfortunately, on June 15, 2020, Bob passed away in London at the age of 14. The real James also made a cameo in the film. James was originally a drug addict who had tried to quit multiple times but failed each time. Every day, he could barely survive by singing on the streets until one day, he accidentally met a stray cat named Bob. With Bob's companionship, he once again felt the beauty of the world and decided to quit his drug addiction. For James, Bob was not just a pet companion but a key symbol of changing fate, representing hope, responsibility, love, and redemption. The story of this man and cat is essentially a prophecy about how lives can save each other and how to rebuild from ruins. James's transformation was not accidental but stemmed from inner struggles and active choices. When Bob became the anchor in his life, he realized that only by letting go of himself could he grasp the gifts of fate. As Laozi said, "Heaven moves vigorously, and a gentleman should strive for self-improvement." When an individual stops sinking, the goodwill and opportunities from the outside world can truly take effect. Underestimation is not the end but an opportunity to reshape oneself. Life is like a long journey, inevitably falling into dark quagmires, as if shrouded by endless gloom. Some are trapped by the shackles of fate, some are lost in the torrents of time. But even in the darkest moments, there is always a glimmer of light to be found. Redemption may come from a cat, a book, or a small act of kindness. But ultimately, only by not giving up on self-rescue can the light gather into a torch that illuminates the future. This flame can melt the sharp ice of fate and illuminate the brilliant starry sky belonging to every life. Well, that's all for today's movie sharing. Feel free to like, comment, and share. Looking forward to our next meeting.
Yeah!